Hi, this is BK Black Krishna from manfulwars.com, where I'm promoting polite patriotism to help nice ladies and gents teach kids to be, look, talk, and feel great, and locally discuss and share great online info offline as better people making better places to live. So check out manfulwars.com for more on that. But this video is called Breitbart Shares Great Official Russian Critique of Western Imperialism. Now, I'm a Westerner myself, but I know that there's definitely critiques of Western imperialism that are out there that should be taken seriously. And with the news, sort of the mainstream news with the sort of Russian collusion hoax against Donald Trump and other sort of anti-Russian propaganda out there, we get a sort of impression of Russia, of sort of being evil, being this, being that. And we don't really learn a lot about how they actually think. It's sort of, well, the Russians do this. Oh, Putin's such an evil, blah, 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 blah. And some of that might be true. I'm not saying that they're all great guys and they're great and we're not. Nothing like that. But there are nuanced criticisms of Russia that are valid, and there are nuanced criticisms of the West that are valid. And so I think this is a great way for people to sort of go, well, what do they actually think? You know, what do they actually think? What do they think of us? Are some of their concerns about the West legitimate? Obviously we don't want to go to war. We don't want to interfere in each other's countries. We'd love to be friendly with each other. But when it comes to their understandable concerns as a very powerful nation in the East, who's being targeted by an even more powerful nation in the West, like America versus Russia, they definitely have have some concerns. So this is a great article featuring Russia's recent appearance at the United Nations General Assembly in New York that kind of explains some of their concerns. And Breitbart News, which is an excellent news source, great politics information, great pop culture information, and I really strongly recommend you sort of check them out for fun as somebody who wants to know what's going on in the world. They were nice enough to share this extended critique of Western imperialism by an official Russian diplomat. And I think that was really, really cool of them to do. They don't go on and on about this. You won't find this on Breitbart or many other news sources every day. Hence, I'm sharing it here in this vlog, and I'll put a link to it below in the description. So this is the article from Breitbart News. Russia at UN. Western liberalism is a scam to maintain American supremacy. There you go. And this is by John Hayward from September 27th, 2019. There you go. And that's a shot of Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And it starts off, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia delivered a sour speech to the UN General Assembly, in which he accused the United States and its European allies of hypocrisy on classical liberal values and claimed they have lodged false accusations against Russia to maintain their own power. Now, you might just be like, well, what else do you expect Russia to say? Of course Russia's going to say that. Yeah, there's some truth to that. I'm not saying that's not a normal, natural response. But there's also some truth when it comes to the U.S. and European and Western allies being hypocritical when it comes to their values. For example, when America says, we can't believe there was foreign interference in our election. That's the worst thing ever. Well, you can go to the same U.S. They've used their CIA to overthrow a couple of dozen dictatorships or a couple of dozen leaders of other countries, right? They've Chile, they got rid of them. They put in Pinochet. Iran in 1954 was their first coup. They got rid of Mohammad Mossadegh and they installed the Shah of Iran. And there's tons and tons and tons of foreign interference in other countries' elections by American intelligence agencies and others, and by corrupt elements within the Western establishment that are worthy of critiquing and criticizing. And so that's fair. And then it says, claim they have lodged false accusations against Russia to maintain their own power. Well, this is something typically governments do, whether it's kings and queens from years ago to presidents and prime ministers today, is they pick a foreign enemy and they say, That country's our enemy. That country's evil. Trust me, empower me to protect you. And governments, often do that. Even the great Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, war is always an excuse for domestic tyranny. If we say we're at war against another country, then we can crack down on our own citizens. For example, the war on terror, we're looking for radical Islamic terrorists. What do? They start spying on us. They spy on us. They surveil us. They feel us up at the airport. A lot of the actions of the war on terror are redirected towards people in countries that are supposedly at war with another group, right? And that's just one example. There's tons and tons and tons of examples. So to say that some people in America, for example, or in the West, might be accusing Russia of things and attacking Russia for things just so that they could empower themselves is not something you can just dismiss out of hand. It's a typical tactic. And Russia will do the same thing as well. Russia and Putin and Lavrov and the rest of them might go, the West is this, the West is that. They hate Russia, empower us. So the criticism works both ways, just like these are universal principles. The interesting part of this Breitbart article is Breitbart sharing official Russian criticisms of the West and forcing the West to look at itself as opposed to always looking at external enemies. It's like, wait a minute, we got corruption in-house, we need to clean up too. And if Russia explains it, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. Just like if Hitler said you shouldn't beat your dog. It doesn't mean like, well, Hitler said that, so it must be wrong, so we should all beat our dogs. It's like, no. Broken clock is right twice a day. And Russia may have a point when it comes to Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's speech at the UN. So back to this article. Lavrov suggested the promise of the United Nations founding was undermined and delayed by the long years of the Cold War. He was enough of a good sport to portray the fall of the Berlin Wall as a positive development, the wall that separated East and West Germany. Once that went down, East Germany was liberated from communism. And now the UN finds itself confronting a world with more conflicts and intractable problems than ever, just as the sun sets on Western diplomatic, economic, and military dominance. So, quote, "It is hard for the West to accept seeing its centuries-long dominance in world affairs diminishing," he said. "New centers of economic growth and political influence have emerged and are developing without them," right? So this is interesting. It's like, well, you've got other emerging economies. The BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Korea, I think, is sort of a Eastern world, with a mixture of Brazil in there, version of the G7, right? It's like the G7 has, or NATO, other Western power blocks. They've got their thing going, so we should have our thing going, right? And he's saying that it's hard for the West to accept this, and so they're lashing out against the rest of the world when it comes to them losing power. Now, how much of this is true? How much of this is not? How much of this is, political posturing by the West and the East, or by America and Russia, or and so on? It's still a worthy question to entertain. And when it comes to this type of critique of the West, it's often hidden from us by our own media. So I'm glad that Mr. Lavrov delivered this at the UN, and I'm glad Breitbart was nice enough to share this article, which quotes Lavrov extensively. It says here, leading Western countries are trying to impede the development of a polycentric world to recover their privileged positions, to impose standards of conduct based on the narrow Western interpretation of liberalism on others, he charged. And this is something that we've been concerned about, right? The post-colonial world in sort of the mid-19th century has led to a new form of colonialism, sort of a corporate colonialism, sort of instead of the kings and queens or presidents and prime ministers in charge of it, governments empower Western corporations to sort of dominate the developing world. And so that's something to be concerned about. Excuse me. Lavrov portrayed the West's insistence upon the principles of classic liberalism and a rules-based international order as a scam, in which firm international laws which, quote, no longer suit the West, unquote, are replaced by, quote, rules adapted to its self-serving schemes, which are elaborated depending on political expediency. In order to justify the revisionist rules, in quotes, the West resorts to manipulation of public opinion, dissemination of false information, double standards on human rights, suppression of undesirable media, and bans on journalists doing their job, Lavrov thundered, dropping a string of accusations that might seem difficult for a Russian to make with a straight face until one recalls the Kremlin's seething anger at Western efforts to rein in Russian propaganda operations. So basically, Russia is accusing the West of doing all sorts of things the West accuses Russia of doing. And you know what? I think they're both right. Having looked at this issue from both sides, I think they're both right. And I think it's good for all of us to understand that. They are both right. Are they right about all the specific details? No, but those are things that we've got to sort of ferret out, to sort out truth from lies, valuable from useless or dangerous information, and so on. And so, Lavrov is saying that, the West resorts to manipulation of public opinion, dissemination of false information, double standards on human rights, suppression of undesirable media, and bans on journalists doing their job. Well, manipulation of public opinion, Obama, under his administration, I think in 2014 or 15, made it legal for the government to propagandize Americans. And there's been lots of other propaganda efforts you can look to. So yeah, they manipulate public opinion, right? Dissemination of false information. That's definitely out there. Double standards on human rights. Absolutely. Some countries, human rights violators, oh my God, worst thing ever. We can't deal with these people unless they clean up their corruption, they clean up their human rights. And yet when it comes to China, the biggest human rights abuser in the world with, excuse me, slave labor camps and nets outside Apple, iPhone, and other Apple computer Foxconn factories, so workers can't jump out the window to their deaths. When it comes to a suppression of dissent, when it comes to jailing journalists, when it comes to spying on, surveilling, and disenfranchising their people, when it comes to Nazi Germany-like conditions for over 1 million Muslim Uyghurs, an ethnic minority in China that are being sent to concentration camps where they've got to disavow their religion, disavow their culture, disavow their heritage, where they're tortured, where they're brainwashed. When it comes to China, the West often takes a pretty hands-off, well, it's China. Yeah, you want to do business in China. China's a big market. Oh, we got to do business. Yeah, it's China. What are you going to do? It's China, right? It's like, wait a minute. So do you or do you not care about human rights, right? And so suppression of undesirable media, lots of online censorship, bans on journalists doing their job, on and on and on. There's tons and tons and tons of evidence of Western double standards when it comes to this. Lavrov sneered at the, quote, teachers' pets, unquote, among former Soviet territories favored by the West and complained about, quote, multilateral agreements reached behind doors that were closed to Russians. So, yeah, the U.S. And the West tends to support former satellites of the USSR, the Soviet Union, that broke away when the Cold War ended and Russia shrunk to its still massive Russian territory with a couple of states remaining with Russia, while others like Ukraine and others separated from Russia to gain their independence. So what does the West do with those? Well, the West is like, well, we have to keep you from falling back under the control of Russia, so we'll put a bunch of weapons there. We'll put military bases there. We'll give aid there. We'll work on subversive anti-Russian propaganda operations there with our own propaganda, right? So, it's not surprising, right? And you could say, well, we should do this because Russia is a threat. Fair enough, right? But it is the type of interference that the West often complains about. So, for example, if Russia's like, well, Cuba's our ally, and they're, a few miles away from the U.S. Why don't we put a bunch of nuclear missiles in Cuba? That started the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, right, where the world supposedly almost went to war while the president of the U.S. was John F. Kennedy, because Russia tried to do that. Russia said, "Oh, okay, you want to, put weapons and bases and fund your allies on our border? Okay, we'll do the same thing with our allies on your border." And the Russian-Cuba relationship has continued since then. But you can see how paranoid it makes America when Russia does that with Cuba or other countries that are close to the U.S. So you can see how paranoid it would make Russia if the U.S. does that to Russia with countries close to Russia, right? Back to this article, quote, "This is accompanied by attempts to privatize the secretariats of international organizations and use them to advance non-consensual ideas in circumvention of unilateral mechanisms," Lavrov said, a relatively cryptic complaint he refined into an attack on the United States for withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA as it's formally known. Well, it's true. The West does try to dominate the United Nations and other international organizations or multilateral organizations, and and they want to advance non-consensual ideas. And part of doing this is demonizing Russia and demonizing the East, especially Russia. Russia's not even a real enemy of the West anymore. Russia's kind of mostly minding their business. And if you don't believe me, you can look at the last few years of the Russian collusion hoax and anti-Russian propaganda. But you can't find that many instances of Russia actively interfering in the affairs of other countries, because those would be promoted. They were involved somewhat in the conflict in Syria. They are involved here and there in operations around the world, but you don't have them overthrowing elected leaders and installing their puppet dictators in ways that the CIA has admittedly done. So, are they completely innocent? As I said, nope, absolutely not. Are they involved in places around the world? Sure. They're the second or third largest country in the world, second or third largest military power, U.S., China, Russia, sort of scrapping for that. And so I'm sure they are involved. I have no doubt. I don't believe the Russians are innocent. But what I do believe is that the demonization going back and forth is done for self-serving ends, right? The West does it so that they can be self-serving and empower themselves and use Russia as the boogeyman. And I'm sure Russians do it to some degree so that they can demonize the West and that their people turn to them for protection and to accept their policies as well. So it goes back and forth. But with all the demonization, anti-Russia demonization out there, it's good to kind of get their official position on these matters of global importance, as opposed to just being spoon-fed our government's own, right? So back to this article, it says here, Washington did not just repudiate its obligations in trying to weaken this resolution, but started demanding from others to play by American rules and to sabotage its implementation. So there is that double standard. The United States has set a hard line towards eroding UN resolutions on the international framework of the Middle East peace process, he continued. It suggests waiting for some sort of, quote, deal of the century. Meanwhile, it has taken unilateral decisions on Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. The two-state solution to the Palestinian issue, which is essential for satisfying the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people and providing security for Israel and the whole region, is in danger, he warned. So, and it might be good to have multilateral support for a two-state solution when it comes to Israel and the occupied territories of Palestine, and it's good for there to be a check and balance on sort of Western imperialism. And I'm a Westerner, believe me, but we don't benefit when our governments are corrupt, right? We can tell in the last several years. For example, even under the British Empire. Whereas the British Empire rules the world. Oh, the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, how did most people in England live? They were poor. They were serfs. They were feudal lords. It wasn't like everyone in England was like, we're balling now. The king and queen are getting stuff from all over the world, and we are balling. It's like, nah. Not really, right? And even in the West, yes, we're doing well, right? But compared to how well some of the super rich, corrupt people are doing in our countries, it's a joke, right? For example, Canada, a country of 35, 36, 37 million people, second largest country in the world, full of resources, right? Way more than Canadians would ever need. Enough to sort of feed the whole world for 100 years. Canadians don't benefit as much as they should from that. Do they benefit? Absolutely. But as much as they should? No. What do I mean? Ideally, Canada, which is 35 million people and a physical territory larger than the US, full of resources. Canadians should all be millionaires. Canadians should be like the way they live in some of those small Arab countries, United Arab Emirates, Dubai, or whatever, where most people are rich, we're driving gold Mercedes. If you come to Canada or talk to Canadians, you realize it's not like that at all, right? People are stacked on top of each other, living in condos, more and more and more condos, more and more condos, despite the fact we've got ridiculous amounts of land. I know a bunch of it's under snow, but for 35 million people, with the second largest country in the world, second largest physical territory next to Russia, Canadians should have a hell of a lot more than they do, right? Canadians are stacked on top of each other in condos. Canadians are paying out the wazoo for energy. Prices are going up. The new carbon tax, the dairy cartel making our carton of eggs cost $3 a carton, while in America you can get a dozen eggs for 99 cents. This is an example of the mismanagement of a Western or colonialist power disenfranchising their own people. Still a great country, still great people, still got a lot of nice stuff, still doing much better than a lot of places around the world. But ultimately, when your leadership gets corrupted like that and does corrupt things like that, it does affect everybody. And we get people like Justin Trudeau, current Prime Minister of Canada, up for re-election or up for getting kicked out of office like he should be on October 21st, 2019. When it comes to Justin Trudeau, he literally says Canada is the world's first post-national state, where there's no national identity, no national character, no national values, no need for borders, and he's the freaking Prime Minister. So how did that happen? How'd that happen? How did we get a leader that bad hidden by our corrupt media? Well, this is how. Right? So it's good to look at your country's own corruption when it comes to these sorts of things. Back to this article, Lavrov segued to Libya, accusing NATO of, quote, blatantly violating UN Security Council resolutions by bombing the country to overthrow its former dictatorship and unleashing the chaos that persists to the current day. Quote, the international community is still untangling the disastrous repercussions of NATO's adventure with African countries affected the most. And it's true, as Hillary Clinton said when she was Secretary of State, when it comes to Libya and Gaddafi, she said, we came, we saw, he died, ha 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 ha. It's a literal quote. She literally laughed like that after that. Now, what was Libya before the U.S. Invaded and got rid of Gaddafi, right? The U.S. bombed them, funded rebels to kick Gaddafi out, right? Libya was the most prosperous and successful African country. Libya and Gaddafi was leading Africa to sort of unite and get their own affairs in order, kind of like a European Union style. He was leading sort of an African Union style to sort of empower African countries. Libya had tons and tons of gold. Libya was thinking of bringing back the gold standard. Libya was trying to empower African nations so that they could resist Western corporations and imperialism more effectively, control more of their own natural resources, keep more of the profits from those natural resources, and so on, right? So Gaddafi was behind all of that. So what did the West do? Called him a dictator, bombed the hell out of him, empowered a bunch of rebels to take him out, and now Libya is a mess. And this isn't the first time they've done that. So it's worth understanding that. You could just hear Libya, Gaddafi, dictator, oh, Gaddafi, dictator, Gaddafi, bad guy, Gaddafi tortured his own people. I'm not saying Gaddafi was perfect, but if you look at on balance at the good things he was doing for his people and for the continent of Africa, you could be like, why wouldn't we support that? Why? Because it interfered with some of the Western imperialist aspirations of Western corporations. That's why Gaddafi was really kicked out, at least according to some interpretations. You can look into this on your own. But it's healthy to understand that. When Russia's saying this, you can't just say, well, Russia's saying this because they're Russia and they hate the West and they're lying. It's like, no, when Lavrov said this about Libya, saying, NATO violated UN Security Council resolutions to kind of keep the peace in Libya by saying, nope, we're calling him a dictator, we're putting it all over TV, we're going to bomb the hell out of him, and we're going to call him a bad guy, and that's our reason. It's not being honest with us. And so it's good to sort of get another perspective on that to get to the truth. Lavrov further accused the West of supporting, shielding, and working with terrorist organizations in Libya, Afghanistan, and especially Syria, where Russia considers all enemies of its client dictator Bashar Assad to be terrorists. So now there's been some evidence of this. Other journalists have found American weapons being shipped to quote-unquote rebel groups. Americans have admitted there have been news stories on this. There have been American soldiers and journalists and others who've talked about this, about how the U.S. strategically works with quote-unquote rebel groups. Now, those rebel groups could be classified as terrorists depending on who you talk to, right? If you're the legitimate ruler of Syria, Bashar Assad, and the U.S. is funding a bunch of groups to bomb places and overthrow you, then you would be calling them a terrorist. And if Bashar Assad in Syria was to fund a bunch of rebel groups in the U.S. to use weapons and terror and have strategic strikes and blow things up to get rid of Donald Trump, then Trump would be right in calling them terrorists, right? So there's some facts behind this. Plus, there's the idea that the war on terror is fake. It's something that the military-industrial complex has used to replace the Cold War, because during the Cold War, America and the West, and the whole world really, had to spend trillions of dollars because they were a threat to each other. But once the Cold War ended and the West and the East and Russia was supposedly at peace, and China into the World Trade Organization, supposedly now a major economic player, world peace, that doesn't do any good for Boeing, Lockheed Martin, all these other companies. I was trying to think of Halliburton, Dick Cheney's company. That doesn't do much good for their bottom line and their profits. And like super rich countries, like super rich companies, and like any company, especially any company that's publicly traded, the pressure is on them to have to constantly increase profits, right? Not even yearly, quarterly profits, every 3 months. What's your growth in 3 months? Oh, we're at 2% growth. Okay, what's your stock price? Oh, it's at $75. Quarterly report comes out, 2% growth, little slow. We'll drop that to $65. All right, so you just lost a ton of money, right? Quarterly profits at 8% growth. Oh, that's not bad. You know what? $75 stock goes to $85, right? This is all part of the machinations of the market. So as part of the end of the Cold War, the war on terror is seen as a replacement. It's an endless war. You can never stop it. There's always going to be terror and so on. And even President Trump is bribing the military-industrial complex. He's saying, in the last 3 years, we have spent over $2.5 trillion making our military the strongest military in the world, the strongest in history, right? Now, part of that's good to have good national defense. You hope you don't have to use it, as he says. But part of it is going, hey, guys, don't kill me. Don't kill me like you killed Kennedy. You can make lots of money. Here's more and more money. Make us new planes, make us new boats, make us new this, make us new that, make us. He knows how it works, right? If I got in there, I'd do the same thing. I'd be like, okay, military-industrial complex, you want to make a lot of money. We want a strong military. Let's work together. Please don't kill me, right? Because if he was truly a peacenik president, saying, at the end of the Cold War, and we've got the war on terror, which we can fight with intelligence services, we don't need a huge military anymore, right? So instead of the $10 trillion Pentagon budget, right? We're going to slash that in half to $5 trillion. That's Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Halliburton, and a bunch of companies going, whoa, that's our $5 trillion, mofo. You think you're going to take $5 trillion from us? Screw you, right? So it all makes sense. And finally, there's been a lot of evidence and proof, and the 9/11 false flag terrorist attacks from 2001 and so on, that indicate that the West and the CIA, or corrupt elements within the CIA and other groups, are behind funding, training, funding, and supporting and arming terrorist groups, right? More terror means more profits. They benefit, and so on. So when Lavrov accuses the West of supporting, shielding, and working with terrorist organizations, it's worthy to consider as a data point, right? It's worthy to consider as a data point, as opposed to going, no way, Russian propaganda, America's great, we'd never do that. No, there's lots of evidence that America has and will again, right? They even say, yeah, we're working with the Afghan Taliban to guard poppy fields, so that because this is what we have to do here, to work here. All that stuff is all selective and subjective, right? You know, they can say we have to do this, right? But you can say, or you say we're not going to do this, right? If Afghan terrorist groups are growing poppies to make opium, to make heroin, to ship it around the world, to kill a bunch of people in America and other countries, right? You know, you could have the generals in the army and diplomats there saying, well, this is their culture, we have to do this, otherwise we won't be here. It's like, but wait a minute, you're doing a whole bunch of stuff here and they don't want you here anyway. Why is this the deal breaker, right? Or if the practice of bacha-bazi is in Afghanistan, where sometimes older men will take a young boy, a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old boy, and use him as a sex slave, right? It's like, oh, he's not gay. He's not actually gay. He's like a young boy. I use him. I have sex with him when I feel like it. I have some frustrations in Afghanistan, whatever, right? There's been literally stories of soldiers having to look the other way. There's a story of a soldier who couldn't take it. It's been a couple of weeks, right? There's American soldiers in Afghanistan working with Afghani soldiers, right? And some of the Afghani soldiers or generals or officers, right? They're into this bacha-bazi thing, and they've got to work side by side with the Americans in this mission to sort of make sure Afghanistan is secure. And this soldier says, I couldn't take it anymore. You know, every time we went back from meetings and missions and so on, this guy would go back to his apartment near mine, and he'd rape the 11-year-old boy he had tied to his bed. He tied an 11-year-old boy to his bed. He left him some food and a place to crap. And then at the end of the day, he'd go back to his apartment and he'd rape this kid. And I've got to, excuse me. And I've got to go to my apartment and try and turn up the radio to avoid hearing this guy raping a kid. And I couldn't take it. So an American soldier said, I couldn't take it. I broke into his room. I beat the crap out of him. It was a major incident. I got disciplined for it. I got sent home, right? That is subjective, right? To say that we have to be okay with that. It's like, that's insane. But they could say, we're not okay with that. We're here providing security for you guys. No opium fields, no raping little boys. And that's the way it is. You got a problem with that? We'll shoot you. We shoot anybody here that has a problem with us, right? They could do that, right? So, there's lots of evidence that the West has worked with corrupt groups and made deals with corrupt groups along these lines. Lavrov spent time lambasting the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons as a corrupt Western political front because the OPCW has dared accuse Assad of using chemical weapons and celebrated Russia's intervention in support of the Assad regime as a major success in combating terrorism, with final victory being international acceptance of Russia, Iran, and Turkey's plans for a post-war Syria. And, it's sort of true, what Lavrov is saying about what's going on in Syria, right? Our interpretation of Syria, at least according to most of the Western and sometimes liberal and even conservative and even patriot media, is Assad is an evil dictator. We need to get rid of him, right? he used chemical weapons. Well, there have been investigations done. Reporters have gone on the ground. They've talked to people. A lot of that stuff is faked. The UN white helmets, faked. Kids falling on the ground, told they're going to be given candy if they play Act for the video cameras, say, look at these children die. People being treated for chemical weapons issues without the people treating them wearing anything to protect them from chemical weapons. All these propaganda images are flashed on our screen to convince us that Assad is a bad guy. And so the West was supporting rebel groups, terrorist groups against Assad. Well, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and other groups said, no, 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 we are going to kick out ISIS, the Islamic State terrorists that the West is backing because they happen to be against Assad. We're going to kick out the other rebel groups. We're going to stabilize Syria. We're going to make sure the elected leader of Syria, Assad, is still there. And then we'll try and clean the place up, right? That was more of a Russian-led initiative. The West was, just like Gaddafi, trying to kick out Assad and create chaotic conditions to weaken the country and steal their resources. Because you've got a weak puppet leader, you've got masses of poor people that aren't aspirational, that can't say, no, no, we don't mind if British Petroleum or Enron or Exxon or the big companies are here, but instead of taking out 96% of the profits from the oil, why don't we go for a 50-50 thing? Right? You're doing all the drilling, you're doing all the digging, you're doing all the work, and you're employing people here. We want more of that money to enrich our own country. Countries that are strong and informed and empowered and stable can do that. Countries that are weak, that are a basket case mess after a civil war, can't. And so that seemed to be the West's intentions in Syria recently. Now, you can double check and fact check all this stuff, or you can call Assad a scumbag, because you've heard him being called a scumbag a bunch of times. But people like Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, an American presidential candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, went over there to meet with Assad. And she's not saying he's a great guy, because the media will crap on her for it, but she's getting a lot of crap for doing that. But she's like, nope. She's a U.S. Congresswoman. She's a presidential candidate. She's also a U.S. Army veteran, and she's currently still in the military reserves and still does active duty training or missions a few times a year as part of still being part of the U.S. Army. She's like, we got to avoid war. We can't just be drummed into war by the media suddenly putting up this guy's picture and saying, this is the new evil guy. See the things we said about Saddam, about Gaddafi, about, all the other evil guys that we want to get rid of. Same thing. This guy's another one, right? All of a sudden, it's a huge crisis. He might have been an evil guy for years. We might have worked with him for years. But now, huge crisis. He's got to go. We got to go to war. We got to kill a bunch of people. We have to have a bunch of our people killed. She was like, no, 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 no. You can't just do that without really looking into it, right? So she went over there and she really looked into it. And she had good meetings with Assad, right? To sort of clarify who he was, what his goals were, and so on, right? And she because she's been smeared so much for doing it, she certainly can't come out and be an Assad apologist, but she can be a war preventionist. And she says she doesn't want to see her brothers and sisters in uniform kill or die for no reason, for no good reason when it comes to Syria. So that's a bit on Syria. Back to this article, quote, the West also has its own rules in the Balkans where it is pursuing an open course of undermining Security Council resolutions on Kosovo and Bosnia. So again, more meddling there. And again, this is all over the world. This sort of thing happens. Lavrov blamed, quote, coups inspired from abroad for destroying the statehood of Venezuela, whose socialist tyranny is another client of Moscow, and accused the U.S. of treating Cuba unfairly in a bid to restore the Monroe Doctrine of U.S. hegemony over Latin America, right? And so, again, some of this might be true on both sides. Does the U.S. and the West intervene in Venezuela? Do they mess around in Cuba? It's been admitted. I mean, this is all sort of public. It's history, and history is often being erased today, but it's very public that the U.S. has done these things. Is Russia doing the same thing? Probably, right? And are they doing it because each other's doing it? Quite possibly, right? But it is a nuanced conversation as opposed to we're good and they're bad. And that's why I'm glad that Breitbart is sharing this this critique, and I'm trying to flesh it out a bit here. But he's literally, Breitbart's literally sharing a lot of the thoughts of Lavrov on the West in an honest and non-propagandistic way. Do they agree with these? No. Could they crap on these? Probably. But what they're doing with this article is they're simply saying this is what the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia is saying to the world at the UN about the US and the West and about the way things are going in general. This is some insight into who they are, as opposed to just being blanketly demonized for being, oh, they're Russia, of course, oh, they kill people, oh, Putin's this, oh, so, just generic condemnation of Russia and Russophobia that were often sold in the media. So back to this article, Lavrov accused NATO of practicing a similar strategy by pushing its sphere of influence towards Russia and complained at length about the U.S. supposedly destabilizing Europe by pulling out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, urging the U.S. and NATO to work on signing new arms control deals. Quote, the United States has lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in its doctrine, he said. The United States is transforming cyberspace and outer space into an arena for military confrontation. Right, and so yeah, they're saying the U.S. and Trump is getting out of a lot of bad trade deals, possibly bad deals when it comes to weapons systems, and saying, well, we'll restrict these weapons to this number and this usage. If you do, okay, good, let's not compete. Trump has announced Space Force, which is sort of, there's the Army, there's the Navy, and there's space. They want to control and weaponize space, right? Probably another gift to the military-industrial complex to keep their profits going and get their support behind him, because Trump's in a real battle against some really evil people. And so you've got to sort of work with some parties as part of this, right? And this is just going to create a new arms race, a new space race, right? Where Trump is we have announced $800 billion to make the most incredible space weapons you've ever seen, right? So that's $800 billion to the military-industrial complex. What does Russia have to do? We in Russia announced $800 billion to make sure Russian space technology and weaponry is top of the line, right? So that's more gifts to the military-industrial complex, more whatever. And so this is a fair complaint. This is a fair concern. Now, I'm totally in favor of Trump and every leader of every country in the world, every nationalist leader defending their own people, having a strong military able to protect their people and deal with threats on the international level. No doubt about that. But when it comes to accelerating this, when it comes to saying, okay, you've got 1,000 nukes, we've got 1,000 nukes, we want 10,000 nukes. Okay, so now we've got to get 10,000 nukes. I mean, that is a really dangerous game all around. So there needs to be some sort of check and balance on this. And I'm glad that that Lavrov is being sensible when it comes to this this critique. Does that mean I completely agree and we should shut everything down? No. But does that mean that we shouldn't be escalating things super fast and weaponizing the entire planet and every square inch of it to the point where it's just a giant pissing contest? It's pissing away trillions of taxpayer dollars. I don't think that's a good idea either, right? So this is all a balancing act, but it's good to have some sort of critique of us, an authoritative critique of us from the Russian foreign minister. Lavrov called for, quote, increased representation of African, Asian, and Latin American countries in the UN Security Council to reflect a more multipolar world and multipolar global economy. Quote, inclusive growth is curbed as a result of the WTO, World Trade Organization norms being supplanted by other rules, methods of unfair competition, protectionism, trade wars, unilateral sanctions, and the blatant abuse of the status of the American dollar. All this leads to the fragmentation of the global economic space and negatively affects people's standards of living. So, yeah, they're basically saying, Western, the rejection of the empowerment of other countries in a multipolar world as part of this conversation is something that he and Russia are against, and I think that's sensible. Right? I think that's sensible. Now, are they perfect? No. Are we perfect? No. But I think that's a sensible policy, so I'm glad it's out there. And that's the end of the article. So again, shout out to Breitbart News for putting this out there. as I said, I trust Breitbart because of articles like this, because of the fact that they're pretty balanced when it comes to explaining things. They're not just sort of propagandistic and hiding things. The author here, John Hayward, didn't editorialize that much, a little bit here and there in this article, but he definitely was like, this is the bulk of what the Russian foreign minister said. It seems to be accurate. A lot of it's in quotes, or a lot of it is explaining the substance of what he was talking about. And I don't think you'd get that from a lot of Western mainstream propaganda media and even Western patriot media in many cases, trying to sort of do the right thing when it comes to being critical of Russia, getting the support of people that have learned to be critical of Russia and demonize Russia and so on. So this is a nice balance to that. And there you have it. BK Black Krishna for manforwars.com. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, and get in touch with questions, answers, ideas to work together, or financial support as you like. Otherwise, I hope this helps, and I'll talk to you soon. Cheers.